of Manor Castle.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendment 2, which appears in my name and the names of the noble Lords Whitty, Curry of Kirkhale and Randall of Uxbridge, and I thank all of them for their support and others who would have offered their support had there been space in our procedures. What we have here is a very simple amendment, but an improved amendment from committee, because as I listened to the discussion in committee, it became obvious that we really needed to ensure that this amendment addresses both health and quality of soil. Now, I'm simplifying slightly, and I refer noble Lords to the discussion back in committee, but in a sense, we've come to realise in recent decades, in a way we hadn't before, that soils are complex ecosystems in their own right. And the health element of this very much addresses that biology aspect, whereas the quality aspect speaks more specifically to the chemical and physical composition of the soil. Now, I think it's interesting that in our first debate today, the noble Lord Deben particularly highlighted the importance of soils when we're talking about biodiversity and climate. And I think that's a useful introduction to this. That's a useful introduction to this debate. Now, we again debated soils at great length in committee, so I'll just very briefly summarise some of the points that were raised. The UK loses more than 3 million tonnes of topsoil every year. Soil is degraded even while it remains in situ. Almost 4 million hectares is at risk of compaction, the life and air squashed out of it, mostly by the passage of heavy farm machinery. Soil can also be contaminated through dangerous damaging substances being swept, blown or landing on it, or sadly, still sometimes, through error or fraud being deliberately placed upon it. We're also just beginning to understand the issue of microplastic pollution, something that cannot be escaped anywhere on this planet. Soils, too, of course, are stores of carbon. They are rich ecosystems. They are stores of life and biodiversity of a scale that we barely have begun to understand. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that the government does, in some quarters at least, recognise the scale of this issue. The 25-year Environment Plan, which is supposedly the big set-piece document outlining what the government intends to do on many pressing issues, says England's soils must be sustainably managed by 2030. Just to drive home that point, my Lords, that's little more than 8 years away. In terms of farming practice, with farmers buying new machinery now they might expect to use for many decades, in terms of the need urgently to plant trees, which is also a soil health and quality issue as well as in so many other areas, for them to reach any kind of size, obviously 8 years is not very long at all. We think about food manufacturers who are going to have to think about their plans for the future and what crops might be available to them. Now, I credit the noble Earl, the Earl of Caithness, in committee for highlighting how your Lordship's House, after a long wrestle, got a significant reference to soil in the Agriculture Bill. And this, of course, is very much the sister bill here. And so surely we have to do the same thing in this bill to get these two bills working and fitting together. For what we have in the priority areas of this bill is we have air and water, and then we have the gap where soil obviously belongs and where this amendment puts it. Now, I want to address a couple of the points that the noble Lord Goldsmith of Richmond said in our debate in committee. One response was that, quote, "The bill gives us the power to set legally binding long-term targets on any aspect of the natural environment." Well, yes, a Secretary of State could set a target at any time. But given there's a scant 8 years to reach the government's own aim of 2030, why wait? Why would a world-leading government wait? Now, the second response from the noble Lord Goldsmith was there's not enough information and knowledge about soils to know what the targets could be. Now, I would acknowledge, as I did in committee, that there is a dreadful shortage of information and understanding of soils, a result of the failure to fund independent agricultural research and extension over decades, the outsourcing of it to agrochemical companies that have advocated highly profitable for them practices that have had such a disastrous impact on soil health and soil quality. But then I would suggest the Noble Minister contradicted himself. He said, developing targets is an iterative process. In other words, something that's developed, evolved and finessed over time. In other words, these targets can be set, improved, developed and worked through. What we need in this bill is the statement that soils has to be there with oil, with air and water. So really what we have now without this amendment is a bill that is a two-legged stool. And someone pointed out to me that they were once used in dairy farming because you could wobble by hanging onto the cow, but that's not quite a practical arrangement for a legal process. Stools need three legs. And what this amendment, small, modest but important as it is, does is put that third leg on the stool. As in our committee debate, the Noble Earl, the Earl of Devon, said, quote, soil warrants its own independent priority status, close quote. For the Noble Earl added, quote, we are at risk of giving it permanent second-tier status, end quote, without this additional amendment. If we're going to be able to grow our food, cultivate and support our natural world, and store the carbon that we must in coming years, decades and centuries, my Lords, I believe that this amendment has to be in this bill. Now, Noble Lords will note that the Noble Lord Currie of Kirkharle, who might well be expected to be sitting in his place and commenting on this bill and having this amendment and having attached his name to it, is not here. The Noble Lord asked me to send his personal apologies for being unable to be here, and he did ask me to share some of his thoughts. So what I'm about to do is now share the thoughts of the Noble Lord Currie of Kirkharle. And he said, I have attached my name to this amendment because it is illogical not to include soil health and soil quality as a key environmental indicator. Soil is our most precious asset, and its status will determine whether or not we achieve net zero by 2050 and whether or not we can feed 10 billion people by 2050. Nothing can be more important than these two objectives. The Republic of Ireland has just committed €10 million to carry out a nationwide soil testing program so that they can establish a baseline of soil health and quality. We have the opportunity to do the same through the ELM scheme if we specify the standard of testing required and create a national database. Why couldn't we take this unique opportunity to position ourselves as global leaders in this crucial area, particularly with COP26 approaching? That finishes the comments of the Noble Lord Currie. So, my Lords, I have indicated informally, and I will now indicate formally, that it is my intention, unless I hear an acceptance from the Noble Lord the Minister that the Government will put the final leg on the stool, it is my intention to put this amendment to a vote. I really feel that we can do nothing else. We would be utterly failing the future if we do not do that. So, my Lords, I beg leave to move.
Amendment proposed, page 2.